So welcome to the 1119 Tech Talk, where we ask the question that Bonnie Tyler has been asking for years: where have all the experts gone, and does anyone understand HTML and CSS? Basically, we'll be looking at basic principles of behind HTML and CSS, and how the front-end coding challenge that we came up with at Koto demonstrates that hardly anyone understands the foundations of HTML and CSS. So, start at the beginning. What is HTML? Stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So that first part, it's text that's linked up. It's nonlinear. You can click on certain bits to go somewhere else or learn something else. Markup. HTML is all about structuring information, marking it up so that a browser can interpret it. So semantic HTML, which is a term you'll hear a lot if you haven't already, is markup that means something, that tells you what the content is. And that's at the core of HTML itself, telling people what the content is of a page. And language. HTML is a language with its own vocabulary and syntactic rules. You'll often, at least I've heard many engineers sort of scoff at HTML. Oh, it's not really a language. But there is a lot of subtlety in it. And so in a nutshell, HTML is all about structure, telling people and machines the meaning and role of each part of a web page. CSS, on the other hand, is all about style. Stands for cascading style sheets. CSS has, so we're going to break that down as well. The cascading part, there's a series of inheritance rules that cascade through your page based on the order of those rules and the specificity of those rules. If you understand those rules, then you can set up defaults and specifically target exceptions to override those defaults. Style, what I got to at the beginning of this, HTML is all about structure, CSS is all about style. It's how you, HTML gives you the meaning behind different parts of the pages. CSS gives you the styling for those things. So you use it to assign sizes, colors, positioning, animations, and so forth. And then sheets. CSS can be broken into multiple style sheets. You can import them separately or inject style elements into the HTML itself. And I promise we're going to get to examples very soon. I just want to make sure we all have a shared understanding of what HTML and CSS are really about at the core, and then we'll go into the examples from our front-end challenge. There are other forms of CSS these days that ultimately get compiled down to CSS. Just wanted to mention them: Less, Sass, and JSS. We're not going to go into the details of those, though. One of the things a lot of people wonder is, can I just use a UI library and avoid learning HTML and CSS at all, or at least avoid learning the details behind them? And yes, you can use a UI library. They're super useful and helpful, but they tend to be structure agnostic. So it's still going to be up to you to decide, okay, do I use a div here? Do I use an article, a header, figure, and so forth? So if you don't understand HTML at its basic level, you're never really going to leverage a UI library well, and your application will suffer. So why should you care about HTML semantics? HTML is the main way you communicate a web page to your visitors. Elements are effectively words or concepts that convey meaning. And just like in a regular language, you can combine those words in lots of ways, but there are only certain combinations that will have a shared grammatical meaning. So if I say it blew without using a verb, you don't know whether am I saying it is blue, am I asking is it blue, am I describing the color blue, or am I saying, was I actually intending to use the verb blue, or to blow? Yeah, using words in an agreed, with an agreed grammar is really how you create a web page that everyone or every browser will understand. And there is a lot of variation in how browsers interpret your code, especially when it doesn't conform to that agreed grammar. And lastly, semantic HTML makes your page much more accessible for disabled persons, particularly people using screen readers to access your site. And so now is where we're going to get to this question of where do people go wrong, and this is where we'll start to dive into that front end challenge. Some of the common mistakes that I've listed out here are, so HTML has a box model, which we'll get to in a minute, and a lot of libraries simplify it for you, but then people who started learning with using something like Twitter's Bootstrap library or framework, they never actually learned how the box model worked. So then if they have to do something outside of Bootstrap, they suddenly break their layout. A lot of people don't know just the basic HTML5 elements unless they were like sexy ones like Canvas, and you can do really cool visuals with them. Divs and spans get overused a lot. Sometimes just as extra containers that aren't needed, and sometimes when there are more semantic elements, particularly some of the newer HTML5 ones. And browser defaults, again, libraries, frameworks often reset those. And so if you learned while using a framework, you might not know what the browser defaults are. And back to divs and spans, a lot of people put them around everything. I've heard from multiple people that, oh, I always put something in a div, or I always put it in a span because I used this tutorial that told me you always wrap things in Angular or things in React in a div or always in a span. So that can be a catch for some people. And just an added FYI, section tag, it was introduced in HTML5, but it's not so semantic. It really is effectively a div with a little added context. So now let's actually look at some of those cases. So this is the front-end challenge that we gave people. I do not pretend that it is a great design or even a good design, but we used it to test whether people could do just some basic, accomplish some basic layout ideas. One of them being, can they make a design evenly, do two evenly sized sections? And they what do they do with an image and a caption? What do they do with a heading? How do they lay out paragraph text? Can they float an image with a caption? Basic things like that. And it's because our monitor here in DC has terrible contrast, we can't even see that there's a Koto logo in the background. Hopefully you guys can on screen share. But can they center, just center an element on the page? How do they treat comments and comment threads? And we also have, there's a whole JavaScript component to this as well. I'm not going to go into that. So this was the challenge. If they wanted to get some of the details, they could click on something, see what the font size was. They could see, oh yeah, I arbitrarily gave this like some extra line spacing, some extra leading to see, okay, do they catch that this is non-standard line spacing and lay it out accordingly. So let's look at what some people did. And I should note that almost all of these submissions were by people who saw themselves as HTML experts. Maybe not all, but the vast majority would have considered themselves experts. So one thing that I saw in multiple submissions was something like this, where we have div class equals paragraph. Oh, this is this first. So the whole point of HTML is to be semantic. So there are a bunch of really valuable tags or elements, also called tags, that we can use. One of the most basic ones is the p tag, which you use for paragraphs. Here instead we have divs with a class of paragraph. If I'm using a screen reader, I'm not looking at what class names are. So this is not super useful for me. And so this particular submission, we have inside the main content of the page, inside the body, we have lots of divs. We do have an image for this background image that's absolutely positioned. And yeah, it's a lot of divs.
41% margin. Okay.
Yes. So this is somebody who clearly, and one of our criteria we did ask was to make the HTML as semantic as possible. So when I see this, I can only assume this person does not understand what semantic HTML is. So yeah, the heading is a div as well. Ooh, I love, they have the link here, which has a class of link, but it's actually not an anchor tag, an A tag. So it's not actually linked up. This, however, is an A tag, the little icon. Okay, so let's move on to another one. And we'll see some more things. So here we have a div called class article image, an image div class article caption. So with HTML5, there was an element added called a figure, and a figure can encompass something, can encompass an image. It can encompass a table, a chart. In this case, but what's really nice about a figure is it can also have a fig caption. And so it's a really nice way of grouping an image with a caption. So a really good alternative way of doing this, rather than a div with another that encompasses an image and div class article caption, make this containing div a figure, image as it is, though maybe give it a better alt tag or alt attribute. Since if I'm using a screen reader, the alt is what's going to tell me what this image is of. But then instead of a div here, we have a fig caption. And now I have, if we were to make this figure and fig caption, this HTML means something. It means I have this contained content that is related. Just nesting something in a div together doesn't necessarily mean that things are related. Note that figure does come with its own, the user agent style sheet gives it some default styles that you might need to override. I would typically do that in a reset so that I don't have to deal with them. And since I mentioned the box model earlier, I'll point it out since we're already inspecting that. So the box model in HTML is basically that you have any given box is made up of content. So this center area, basically what's inside that element, padding, space around that element. In this case, there is no padding. Let's just add a style so we can see it. Padding 10px. So 10 pixels. So content, padding, and border. Currently, there is no border. Border goes around the padding. So padding is internal spacing. Border, let's do 2px, solid. And because I am a big fan of fuchsia or hot pink, oh, I did 20px, 2px, okay. So now we have content, padding, and border. So that is basically what any given box is made up of. Now, if those are set to 0, then your box is entirely content. So that's basically the box model, and we'll get to some. Actually, let's see. I forget if this one is sized correctly. So we see 802 pixels wide and 797. So it's a little bit off, but it's not so far off. Let's check this. I think this first one was evenly divided. 830, 820, yeah, okay. So let's jump to, here's one. And basically I want to show you where the box model, where people often will make a mistake not understanding how the box model works. So here the left side of the page is 863 pixels wide, and the right side is 733. So we see that, like, okay, this is pretty significantly different. So let's look at sizing of these. In this, they assigned it to the width, a max width of 50 VW. Now, VW is the width of your viewport or your browser. So theoretically, this left half of the screen shouldn't be more than half of the viewport. And just so we can see, okay, our viewport is 1660, so 830. Clearly this is 863, so it's more than half. It also doesn't encompass the full left side, like there's this margin around the entire thing, so this could potentially be more than half of the page anyway. Or this with the margin out here could be more than half of the page. But even by itself, it's more than half of the page. Let's look at why that is. Notice the padding here is 32 pixels. And there's a border right of 1 pixel. So that's 33 pixels. And then half of the page, we said the full width of the page is 1660 pixels. So half of the page is 830. That is your content. And then we also have another 33 pixels with the padding and the border. And this goes back to the early days of HTML and CSS, when people weren't worried about making like all these like different card layouts and like very carefully measured layouts. It was really about, okay, I have some text on a page and maybe some images that are associated with it. And back then, if you assigned the width to something or the height to something, you were assigning the size of the content and not the size of the box overall. It was only as we started doing more complex layouts for the web that people really wanted to size what they really wanted, well, what became the box sizing property. And it's through the box sizing property that you can assign a value of border box to encompass padding and border. But by default, that property, we go to computed and find box sizing. By default, that is a content box. So if we really want to make this half of the screen, we could do box sizing border box, and suddenly that shrinks now to 797 plus 33 for 830 pixels wide. And this was a mistake that we saw in at least half of the submissions, because we didn't give them a UI framework to use by default. A few people chose a framework to use, but most people, without using a framework, they ended up with this kind of a mistake where they had extra width on the left side of the page, and then the right side was either, in some cases, it was actually being kicked below the left side if you resized the page too much, or in this case, here it has, because they're using Flexbox, the right side is just compensating to be whatever width is left over from the left side. Make sense? I'm flying through a bunch of layout concepts, so feel free to to shout out if something is confusing. So we've seen people using divs instead of semantic HTML for whether it's for headings, paragraphs, figures, and captions, or fig captions. Let's see, let's go back to, oh yeah, so I mentioned there are lots of different HTML5 elements. One of them actually that this person got is a header. But then we saw, let's see, this person used an H2, which is a reasonable interpretation. We didn't tell them what the main heading is, so you could argue that it could be the text front-end challenge, or it might be the title here. But an H2 is a second level heading. That's perfectly reasonable as an interpretation. HTML5 also has a time element, which is a great thing to wrap any date or time or duration that you have in a page. You can feed in, and so your time element wraps a human readable time or date. But then you can also insert an attribute on a time element of a date time attribute that gives with basically a machine readable precise date time, which is a great way of embedding a precise time in your elements, even if you're like displaying something friendly like yesterday or 2 hours ago. Boom, boom, boom. Oh yes, so let's find some divs and spans. So let's see what this person did with paragraphs. So this is another thing that I saw multiple people doing, and that's wrapping every paragraph in a div. And this gets, I think one of the roots of this is learning when a lot of people, when they've learned to use a framework like React or Angular, they learned that you always wrap whatever whenever you have a for loop or something, you wrap the content in a div, or you wrap it in a span. And this goes to this requirement in frameworks that you have a single outer element. But a lot of the tutorials will just say you need to wrap things in a div, rather than saying you need there to be a single outer element. So then they end up, rather than like, if there's a semantic thing like a figure or a paragraph, they end up putting a div around it, even if there's only a single element. In this case, they basically had a for loop that was exporting a div with an image inside it anytime if there was an image in the data, but if there wasn't an image, then they were exporting this empty div that is kind of terrible to have in the code. But let's look at, so there are a couple of things. We have extraneous divs. We have divs wrapping paragraphs. So the paragraphs aren't even on a parallel level anymore. They're each like nested in some deeper structure. So if I'm going through this, it's not immediately clear that these paragraphs are directly related. If I'm just looking at the structure of the web page. And then they have some wonky stuff going on with the styling of their image. Here they did a width of 100%, but then a max width of 22 VH, which I have no idea why they did that. It looks fine at like smaller sizes, but as soon as you get to above, say, how big is this? Roughly 1,000 pixels. Or if you get below 1,000 pixels, the layout gets very strange with the image and the caption. And again, here they're using a span instead of and a div instead of a figure and fig caption. And I think this might have been. Oh no, it's a different one that does the crazy layout. So they had this interesting thing they're doing here, making this image with a max height. I'm not sure why. If you no longer give it a max height, suddenly it's the same width as the caption that's associated with it. Okay. And these are recurring. I'm not going to go through all of the challenges we went through, but these were really recurring themes where we might see a heading up here and we might see paragraph tags. But often those paragraphs were wrapped in divs or like some of these more obscure or lesser known elements like time were left out. I saw maybe 2 people use a figure with a fig caption. This particular challenge left out the captions entirely. And I didn't mention, there's also, I saw a lot of this where people interpreted semantic HTML to be add a class name that says article body or article title, article meta, that sort of thing. There's an HTML tag called an article. And so rather, this doesn't even need a class name if you use the tag article. And then similarly, you don't really need the class title if you have a heading inside an article. So I'm going to look at a couple more of these, and then we'll get back to sort of what we can do. So again, we have a div containing the image and caption, but instead of using, we have like a div with a class of article image container and a div with class article image footnote. These could be a figure and a fig caption. We did see some people catching that this would be a header up here. But then a lot of people, here's a heading. This should be an H tag. It's a div with a class of article title. Let's see. Ooh, are you the one? One of these, yes, I think, yes. So here we have the layout breaking entirely because they used an image with a fixed width with like they're using Flexbox to basically overcome some layout issues. And so they have an image with an assigned width, and then they have a span that is by default inline. And so once the left side gets big enough to contain the image at 400 pixels, it throws the image and the span together on one line, and then adjusts the image to fill the remaining space. So there's a lot of, in general, I saw a lot of like people leaning on Flexbox for layout without fully knowing how it worked. And I rarely saw just the simpler, older layout approaches like, okay, we could have just assigned this to have a width of 100% of its container, and then it would never have had that kind of layout issue. It also wouldn't have needed, it would have allowed us to eliminate two of these styles. Okay, so somewhere, yeah, this one didn't have a single paragraph. It's basically just they appear to have put a return after each one, but it's not encapsulated in paragraph tags. However, the heading and article information and the link are each paragraphs, which I just found ironic. The paragraphs don't have paragraphs, but the heading information does. And I haven't even gotten into sort of the details or the issues with the right side. There's a lot that one could say about this. It could be wrapped in an aside. It could be well, in this particular case, they did div class equals buttons, but they did not actually make the buttons buttons. Button is an HTML element that you would typically use for something like these icon buttons that has some interactive component within the page. You click it and there's a response within the page. We also sometimes saw people using anchor tags instead of buttons. My general rule is you use an anchor tag, which is your standard like linking tag, what you would use to link to another page or to another part of the same page. But a button is what you would use when you stay in the same place and it changes. Clicking that element would change something in the page. So if I click a thumbs up, it should add a like to this comment. Or if I click a share button, it should give me some sort of sharing options within the page. Okay, so now these are some of the common mistakes that we see with this. So Whitney wants to know, how will I know what HTML and CSS to write? So the first guideline that I would give you is to treat HTML and CSS like languages. Learn their vocabulary and their grammar. In particular, read specs from the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. I can't speak, consortium. The HTML5 specification for content models is really useful. If you have not read it, it may change your life. It goes through basically what different types of content you can have in a website. Flow content, which pretty much, well, almost everything that we think about in HTML is flow content. Pretty much everything except for some metadata. Phrasing content, which is basically it's largely for elements that are phrasing content are often the things like the EM tag or the strong tag, superscript, subscript, all of these inline text markup tags. These are meant to be to mark up small phrases of content. Whereas things that are flow content but not phrasing content tend to be these block level elements that are sectioning your page or dividing up the content of your page. Within flow content, there are heading elements, there are sectioning elements, and these have their own implication for how, for example, how headings are applied. And then there are also interactive elements. There's metadata. I'm not going to go into all of the details of all of these, but it's this specification is really, really useful for understanding how HTML is structured. I also recommend that you read the really outdated CSS1 specification specifically because it is so much simpler than CSS today. And if you form that, and they give you this nice warning, if you get a strong understanding of how CSS used to work, it will give you a much stronger foundation to add things like Flexbox and CSS Grid on as other layout approaches on top of all of this. And also just the way that this is laid out, it is much, you can read it much more in a much more linear way, whereas CSS documentation today is split out into a bunch of different modules, and there isn't as clear a flow if you're learning CSS from scratch, what to start with. So I recommend reading this and then start looking at the newer documentation from there. And also, I've been leading lunch and learns in DC on HTML and CSS since March. And for the first bunch of them, I created Medium posts. Then I was in the throes of buying a condo, and so that got put on pause. But you can hear there, I go through a lot of the basics, including a bunch of what went into this presentation in the first of the posts. And I go through through most of the different elements and in a pretty logical way of, what I think at least is a logical way of thinking about them. So you can check those out for a guided intro to HTML and CSS. And I do link to the W3C specs a lot in those because I think the specs are super useful. And on that note, if you aren't sure how to use a tag, look up the spec and read it. Read like the W3C specifications will tell you what elements can be contained by an element and what elements you can put that inside of, and it'll tell you what attributes you can add. Gives you all of the information you could need. And if you feel like, oh, there should be some good way to group an image and a caption, just Google it and you'll probably find an element exists to do it. And if all of that fails, feel free to phone, text, meet in real life, email, Slack, Hangout, FaceTime a friend. And I'm happy to be that friend. So lastly, I know that 50 Cent has 21 questions, but I think they are not so relevant. If you have some questions, I would love to take them at this point.
Do we have any examples of people that did the Koto front-end challenge that were like smashing successes? Like what is?
There were one or two that were quite good. Here, I can pull that up. Just one moment. I don't have that one already running.
So, or could you summarize what? So a lot of from the examples that you showed of what people did wrong, it was a lot of like didn't necessarily understand box model, or people weren't using the semantic elements of HTML5. Everything was a div. Like those were the two common themes that I pulled out. And therefore, we're be putting divs in my HTML again. That's it. Like, is that the only difference between that and something that was a smashing success? Is that
I mean, there were style details, and this one is by no means perfect on the styling itself, but the semantics here are pretty good. There were a lot of like styling details where people didn't, lay out things particularly well. This particular one has some like weird stuff going on with the header. However, the semantics are excellent. We have a heading here inside a header that's inside an article. Articles are sectioning content, so if you put a header inside them, it basically means this header is for the next level sectioning container, and so this header is for this article that contains it. The article and comments are inside a main element, which is semantically means this is the main content of my site. They use a header element up here. They have a figure with a fig caption and image. Their classes are actually about styling. So typically, like here, like they have a text muted style for this like grayed out, this slightly gray text. And they're able to do this as a like general rule. And there's no need for like a class of, image caption or something like that, because they're using the element fig caption, which tells me this is a caption for the figure's contents. They have paragraphs that are all on the same level as one another. They have here another figure with fig caption. Technically, this is actually bad HTML. You shouldn't nest a figure inside a paragraph. But that's, more of a nitpick. This stays, so they didn't do mobile styles, but generally, like, as you resize everything as you resize within like regular web page, desktop sizes, everything stays reasonably proportioned, with the exception of this like header text, which gets a little crazy up here. So this was a pretty good example. By no means perfect, but pretty good.
And we should mention that using semantic HTML and styling was not the primary criteria
that we were judging on.
So, the primary criteria were faithfulness to the mocks, functionality, how good is their JavaScript and React.
And probably that last bit more than anything, but
we noticed a lot that had non-semantic HTML.
Mm-hmm.
More of a secondary criteria.
So and then those like basic, like a lot of the mistakes that people made were really, it wasn't that, they didn't understand how to do some complex, how to work out some complex CSS issue. It was that they didn't understand like something as fundamental as the box model, which I think is because a lot of frameworks take care of, like they simplify it, making everything border box by default. And so people will never even learn what a content box is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
You've sufficiently scared me into always using Bootstrap.
No, don't always use, you don't need to always use Bootstrap. Just learn some of the basics. It is actually really, really useful. Even just learning like what are all of the tags that I could use. Like what do each of these things mean? What does it mean to use a nav, a main, H tags, header, footer, address, and so on. Block quotes for these are all like really, even just like reading through a list like this, which is in the first of the Medium posts I did, like it will have a really big impact on the HTML that you write, and it'll make your code a lot better and a lot more meaningful.
Cool. Dude, was that around when you were here? Yeah.
No, yeah, it's Stu and I created that challenge together.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone.